the economy a big part of what ultimately becomes the lived experience of so many people, if not everyone in the country. And that's why we've decided once again to bring back Kim Silberman, an economist, helping us in some ways think through the numbers and what they ultimately mean. Kim, it's great to see you in a much more controlled environment, some people might add, especially given today's weather. But we'll take what is thrown at us, because that's really the nature of South Africans, including some of the hiccups we've seen along the way. But I was hoping to engage you on, in many instances, people, depending who you ask, see the State of the Nation address as just a wish list. You know, government comes through, they lay out their plans, some of them more ambitious than others. I mean, we've heard of smart cities before, but ultimately it is the budget that is going to see through any, if not all, of those plans. The question then becomes, to what extent you reckon we should look out for that? You know, the extent to which the SONA speaks to this budget.
That's a very good point, and I think it's something that our Water and Sanitation Minister, who was just on, was also referring to. The user pays principle versus the taxpayer pays. And those are some of the fiscal choices that we need to make. I think what we can look to in the SONA to get some kind of clue and hope for how everything will get funded and who is going to pay is our President's allusion to the private sector and an embracing of the private sector as a partner going forward in infrastructure build.
Yeah, Dean McPherson is the Public Works and Infrastructure Minister, who we've also spotted here. His ambition is to turn South Africa into a construction site. We spoke about ambition a bit earlier on. And again, at some stage, there are questions, as you just mentioned, around where that money is ultimately going to come from to see that through.
Yeah, I think, you know, as a developing country with needs that are beyond just what capitalism can provide, there's an argument to be made for the provision of national services such as free basic services, free basic electricity and water, etc. And that isn't going to come from the private sector. And so there's always a balance. But I think the approach of the user pays is something that we need to embrace, and it's something that we need a lot of political leadership behind. So we've gone the user pays approach, and it requires that those who use electricity and water pay for the electricity and water that they use, as opposed to an SOE like Eskom, where the arrears bill is 100 billion, and now Eskom is asking National Treasury to bail them out. In which case, you've got a user pays model, but actually the taxpayer has to pay. And so political leadership is really required there to force through a politically probably quite unpopular decision to force the user to pay. And that's the only way you could really get private sector involved. So it all comes down, I think, to political leadership to bring the private sector in.
Yeah, well, the elections have come and gone, so hopefully politicians are more willing now to drive through some of those more unpopular decisions that they need to. Speaking about the politics of, I suppose, this moment, we've seen how US politics might potentially affect what's taking place here at home. Donald Trump at every turn, I think, having people speaking, and that's having an impact on the markets. The question, I suppose, for you is, now that there has been this threat in some ways that has been seen through to pull funding, we're going to have to start having conversations about reprioritizing what we've got in our kitty in order to see through some of these ambitions.
Yeah, and they're just really tough choices, as you know, fiscal choices. Again, if 8 billion of HIV/AIDS funding is going to be withheld from South Africa, where does that money come from? And we've just spoken about the infrastructure budget and municipalities and provinces. So their budgets have all been cut. Can we cut those more? You know, and we all know what the problems that happen and that we find ourselves in when we cut that budget. But do you then cut the SRD grant or social grants in order to pay for HIV funding? It's very difficult fiscal choices.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, a question was asked at some stage about whether or not the finance minister has seen today's State of the Nation address, for obvious reasons, right? Because in many ways he needs to, as we've been saying for much of our conversation, see through whatever the president has to say. But I mean, typically, do you find that there is not really a conversation, but a connection at the very least that does happen? I mean, in the past, for example, they'd say that a Thabo Mbeki would be a whole lot more straightforward about what it is we can and can't do given our fiscus. But over the years, has that art been lost?
I think there's a lot of tension between Treasury and the government, just as there's a lot of tension between Treasury and the Reserve Bank. So, Treasury would like to see inflation a bit higher. Treasury would like to see interest rates a bit lower. And I think what you're seeing is that government is kind of in the middle of some of the policy choices that we have to make, because ultimately where South Africa finds itself is we've got to take some pain now in order to get the gain later. And politically, that's very hard to sell.
Indeed, a very difficult pill to swallow indeed. Kim Silberman, thanks very much indeed for helping us understand these moments. We'll have a conversation, I imagine, after 7 o'clock to see how much of what's being said can actually ultimately happen. Kim Silberman is an economist helping us think through just an aspect of the State of the Nation address. Often, of course, government speaks about their ambitions to clamp down on the triple threat of poverty, unemployment and inequality. The question is whether or not the solutions presented this time around will finally shift the dial.